In 1941, in the Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo, one of the most fateful miscalculations in military history was taking shape. Senior Japanese admirals, fresh from stunning victories across the Pacific, gathered to assess American industrial capability and military equipment. Among the intelligence reports crossing their desks were photographs and specifications of a small, seemingly insignificant vehicle the Americans called the Jeep. It weighed barely over a ton. It carried just 4 men. Its engine produced a modest 60 horsepower. The admirals looked at this primitive-looking contraption, compared it to their own Type 95 Kurigane reconnaissance car, and dismissed it as yet another example of American mechanical crudeness. What they didn't know was that this ungainly little machine would become the symbol of everything they had underestimated about their enemy, and that within 4 years, it would roll across every beach, every island, and every piece of ground they had sworn to defend to the death. The Japanese military establishment in the early 1940s had every reason for confidence. By December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army had conquered vast territories across China, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia. Their naval aviators had achieved what many Western observers thought impossible, sinking the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse with aerial torpedoes. When they struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, they crippled the American Pacific Fleet in a single morning. Within months, Japan controlled an empire stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, encompassing millions of square miles and tens of millions of people. Japanese military planners believed they had secured a defensive perimeter so vast, so resource-rich, and so heavily fortified that no American force could possibly breach it. The Americans would be forced to negotiate a peace that recognized Japan's new empire. This was the prevailing wisdom in Tokyo as 1942 began. It's worth noting that Japanese confidence wasn't entirely unfounded. The Imperial Japanese Army had pioneered its own reconnaissance vehicle well before the Americans. The Kurigane Type 95, entering production in 1936, was actually one of the world's first mass-produced four-wheel drive vehicles, predating the Willis MB by 5 years. Designed by engineer Tetsuji Makita and built by Tokyo Kurigane Industries, the Type 95 featured a 33-horsepower air-cooled V-twin engine and could accommodate 3 personnel. It had proven itself in Manchuria, where its air-cooled engine performed reliably in extreme cold conditions where water-cooled engines would fail. Japanese officers praised its utility in China and Southeast Asia. Between 1936 and 1944, Japan produced approximately 4,700 Type 95 vehicles. To the Japanese military mind, they had already solved the problem of battlefield reconnaissance and light transport. When intelligence officers showed their superiors photographs of the American Jeep, the reaction was predictable. Here was another Western vehicle, slightly larger than their Type 95, seemingly designed for the same purpose. The Japanese had gotten there first. The Americans were simply catching up. What the admirals in Tokyo failed to understand was not the Jeep itself, but what it represented. In June 1940, the United States Army had issued specifications to 135 American automotive manufacturers for a new quarter-ton reconnaissance vehicle. The requirements were stringent and the deadline impossibly tight. The vehicle had to weigh no more than 1,300 pounds, feature four-wheel drive, carry a crew of 3+ equipment, mount a machine gun, and be capable of traversing any terrain. The manufacturer had to deliver a working prototype within just 49 days. It seemed an impossible task. Only 3 companies responded to the challenge. American Bantam Car Company, despite being the smallest bidder, delivered the first prototype, nicknamed the Blitz Buggy, in September 1940. The Army immediately recognized its potential and shared the designs with Willis Overland Motors and Ford Motor Company. By mid-1941, after intense testing and refinement, Willis Overland won the standardization contract with its MB model, featuring the powerful Go Devil engine that produced 60 horsepower. Ford began building an identical version, the GPW, using shared specifications. Then came Pearl Harbor. The modest initial order of 16,000 vehicles suddenly expanded into something unprecedented. The entire American automotive industry mobilized. By the time Japanese admirals were examining intelligence reports about this American vehicle in early 1942, they were looking at production numbers from the previous month. What they didn't realize was that those numbers were about to explode. Willis and Ford weren't just building Jeeps. They were preparing to mass-produce them on a scale Japan's entire automotive industry couldn't match. By the end of 1941, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, over 8,500 Jeeps had already been produced. By the end of 1942, that number would exceed 100,000. The Japanese had built fewer than 5,000 Type 95 vehicles in 6 years. The Americans would build that many Jeeps in 6 weeks. Meanwhile, in Washington, General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, was orchestrating the largest military expansion in American history. Marshall understood modern warfare in ways the Japanese High Command was only beginning to comprehend. He had studied mechanized warfare extensively during the interwar years and recognized that mobility and logistics would determine victory in the Pacific. When Major Walter Bedell Smith brought him the Jeep design in early 1941, Marshall's response was immediate and decisive. The Jeep wasn't just a reconnaissance vehicle. It was a logistics multiplier, a force projection tool, and a symbol of American industrial might. Marshall would later call it America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. He wasn't exaggerating. By the time the first major American counteroffensive began at Guadalcanal in August 1942, Marshall had ensured that thousands of Jeeps were flowing to the Pacific Theater. The Japanese first encountered American Jeeps in significant numbers during the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces had established a strategic airfield on the island, which they intended to use as a base for disrupting Allied supply lines to Australia. When the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore on August 7, 1942, they brought hundreds of Jeeps with them. Japanese defenders watched in growing disbelief as these small vehicles poured off landing craft and immediately began racing across terrain that should have been impassable. The Jeeps carried troops, towed artillery pieces, evacuated wounded, and transported ammunition. They operated in the fetid jungles, through the mud, across rivers, and up steep slopes that Japanese officers had assumed would limit American mobility. The Type 95 Kurigane, for all its utility, had never been produced or deployed in such numbers. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal counted hundreds of American Jeeps within the first weeks of the invasion. Where were all these vehicles coming from? How could the Americans produce and transport so many? The contrast between Japanese and American logistics was becoming painfully apparent. Japan had devoted its industrial capacity primarily to building warships and aircraft. Mitsubishi, Nakajima, and Tachikawa focused on fighters and bombers. The Type 95 Kurigane had been built largely by hand, without assembly line production techniques. Japan's goal had been to produce 5,000 units total. The Americans, meanwhile, had transformed their automotive industry into a military production machine. Willis Overland's factories in Toledo, Ohio, operated around the clock. Ford built Jeeps at 5 different plants across the United States: Dearborn, Michigan; Chester, Pennsylvania; Dallas, Texas; Louisville, Kentucky; and Richmond, California. At peak production in 1943, the Americans were building 1 Jeep every 2 minutes. By the end of that year, over 360,000 Jeeps had been manufactured. As the island-hopping campaign progressed through 1943 and 1944, Japanese defenders on islands across the Pacific witnessed the same overwhelming pattern. American amphibious forces would assault a beach, and within hours, Jeeps would be racing inland. They appeared everywhere. They carried wounded Marines to aid stations. They towed 37mm anti-tank guns into position. They mounted Browning 50 caliber machine guns and became mobile weapons platforms. They were converted into ambulances, with improvised platforms that allowed them to slip through enemy territory, evacuating casualties. They ran supply convoys along bulldozed tracks from coral beaches to front lines. They operated communications equipment. They transported commanders to forward positions. General Douglas MacArthur rode in a Jeep during his advance on Manila. Admiral Chester Nimitz used them across captured islands in the Central Pacific. The Jeep's low silhouette allowed it to operate closer to front lines than conventional vehicles. Japanese officers captured during the later stages of the war told interrogators about their growing sense of helplessness when facing American logistics. One Wehrmacht general, interviewed by historian Hugh Cole after the war in Europe, spoke of German soldiers' desire to capture Allied jeeps whenever possible. The Japanese felt the same desperation. A captured jeep was a prize beyond measure. It represented everything Japanese forces lacked: mobility, reliability, spare parts, fuel. But captured jeeps were rare. When Japanese defenders destroyed one in combat, 3 more would appear the next day. By 1944, Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands reported seeing dozens of jeeps operating behind American lines. The psychological impact was devastating. If the Americans could transport this many vehicles to remote Pacific islands, what else were they capable of producing? The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Between 1941 and 1945, Willis Overland produced 363,000 jeeps. Ford produced 280,000. Total production exceeded 640,000 units. 50,000 were exported to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. Thousands more went to British and Commonwealth forces. The remainder served American forces across every theater of war. In the Pacific alone, tens of thousands of jeeps supported operations from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. Japan, by contrast, never exceeded 5,000 Type 95 vehicles total. By 1944, production had ceased entirely as Japanese industry struggled to build basic military equipment. The industrial disparity was staggering. For every Type 95 Japan built, America produced more than 130 jeeps. Moreover, the versatility gap was equally profound. The jeep could be modified for virtually any role imaginable. Engineers developed specialized kits for the Pacific theater. Jungle jeeps featured larger wheels, with tractor-like tires, for improved mobility in mud and swamps. Jeeps were fitted with flanged steel wheels and operated on railroads throughout the Pacific, pulling supply trains where conventional locomotives couldn't operate. In the Philippines, a single jeep pulled a 52-ton supply train for 19 miles, averaging 22 miles per hour. Jeeps were converted for amphibious use, modified as field ambulances for the Marine Corps, equipped with wire cutters to defend against Japanese booby traps, and even airdropped behind enemy lines. The Americans seemed to find a new use for the jeep every week. Japanese military planners, reading intelligence reports about these modifications, struggled to comprehend the industrial flexibility this represented. By the time American forces began their final approach to Japan's home islands in 1945, the jeep had become ubiquitous across the Pacific. On Iwo Jima, in February 1945, Marines stormed ashore supported by waves of jeeps that landed directly from LSTs and immediately began transporting ammunition and evacuating wounded across the volcanic ash beaches. Japanese defenders, entrenched in caves and bunkers, watched as hundreds of jeeps operated with impunity behind American lines. On Okinawa in April 1945, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater, jeeps landed in such numbers that they seemed to blanket the invasion beaches. 60,000 American troops came ashore on the first day, and with them came thousands of jeeps. Japanese commanders reported the psychological impact on their troops. The sheer scale of American logistics was crushing morale. If the Americans could transport this many vehicles to islands just 350 miles from Japan, how could the home islands possibly be defended? The entire episode demonstrates the fundamental miscalculation that cost Japan the Pacific War. Japanese admirals had looked at individual weapon systems and judged them in isolation. The jeep seemed unremarkable compared to their Type 95. What they failed to understand was that war in the 20th century wasn't won by superior equipment alone, but by superior production, superior logistics, and superior industrial organization. General Marshall understood this. President Franklin Roosevelt understood this. American industrial planners understood this. They built a system where vehicles like the Jeep could be mass-produced, modified for diverse roles, transported across vast oceanic distances, maintained in jungle conditions, and replaced when destroyed. It was this system, not the vehicle itself, that Japanese planners had so catastrophically underestimated. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, later wrote in his memoirs that senior officers regarded the Jeep as one of 5 pieces of equipment most vital to Allied success. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who followed American forces across multiple theaters, wrote about the Jeep with genuine affection. It did everything. It went everywhere, was as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It constantly carried twice what it was designed for and still kept going. That versatility, that reliability, that sheer abundance became the signature of American military power in the Pacific. When American occupation forces finally entered Japan in August 1945, the first vehicles to roll through Japanese cities were Jeeps. Japanese civilians and soldiers alike turned their backs in a gesture of ultimate respect as General MacArthur's convoy passed, but they were also witnessing the physical embodiment of why they had lost. Not because the Jeep was a wonder weapon, but because it represented an industrial capacity they could never match. In many ways, the story of the Jeep in the Pacific is the story of the entire war in miniature. It began with Japanese confidence bordering on contempt. It progressed through mounting evidence that this confidence was misplaced. It climaxed in the humbling realization that American industrial might was simply overwhelming. By the war's end, over 647,000 Jeeps had been produced, and they had served in every conceivable military role across every theater of operations. The vehicle that Japanese admirals had dismissed in 1941 had indeed rolled across every beach in the Pacific, just as it had rolled across North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. It had carried generals and privates, wounded and supplies, ammunition and communications equipment. It had operated in deserts and jungles, mountains and swamps, through mud and sand and snow. It had been one of the first vehicles to conquer the Burma Road, replacing hundreds of Chinese-bound vehicles that sat on docks in Rangoon as the Japanese advanced. The story of Japanese admirals mocking the Jeep is ultimately a story about the danger of underestimating your enemy's industrial capacity, about the difference between tactical excellence and strategic vision, and about the reality that wars are won not just on battlefields but in factories. The Jeep became an icon not because it was technologically superior to every other vehicle, but because it represented a system of production, logistics, and innovation that the Axis powers simply couldn't match. General Marshall called it America's greatest contribution to modern warfare because he understood that mobility and logistics were the foundations upon which military victory was built. The Japanese learned this lesson the hard way, watching helplessly as thousands upon thousands of these small, ungainly, supposedly unremarkable vehicles rolled across islands they had sworn to defend, carrying American forces ever closer to Tokyo. The vehicle they had mocked became the vehicle they feared, not for what it was, but for what it represented, the unstoppable industrial might of an aroused democracy. What do you think of the Jeep's role in the Pacific War? Was it truly America's greatest contribution to modern warfare, as General Marshall claimed? Or was it simply one tool among many in the Allied arsenal? Did the Japanese military's dismissal of the Jeep represent a broader failure to understand industrial warfare? Or were they simply outmatched by factors beyond their control? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.